I didn't expect to find someone living in my cabin when I came back from deployment, but that's exactly what happened when I pulled up the snow-covered driveway in January after 3 months overseas with my Special Operations Unit. The sun was setting behind the Colorado Rockies, casting long purple shadows across the snow that had piled at least 4 feet high around my property near Breckenridge. My truck's headlights caught something that made my stomach drop. Smoke was coming from my chimney. Fresh tire tracks led to my detached garage. The windows I'd left dark and shuttered were glowing with warm light. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, my military training kicking in automatically. Someone was in my house. Someone had made themselves at home in the cabin I'd built with my own hands 5 years ago. I reached for my phone, then decided against calling the police just yet. I wanted to see what I was dealing with first. My name is Henry Kolson, and I've been in the Army for 12 years, the last 6 with Special Operations. I'm not easily rattled. But coming home to find your sanctuary violated hits different than any combat situation I'd faced in Afghanistan or Iraq. This was personal. I stepped out of the truck, the cold air biting at my face after the warm interior. The snow crunched under my boots as I approached the front door. Before I could even reach for my keys, I noticed something that made my blood pressure spike. The lock had been changed. My key wouldn't even fit in the deadbolt. I knocked. Hard. After a moment, I heard footsteps inside. The door cracked open, and a woman in her mid-40s peered out at me with suspicious eyes. She had the kind of face that looked like it was permanently set to, "I need to speak to your manager." Her blonde hair was styled in that aggressive bob cut, and she wore a ridiculous amount of jewelry for someone supposedly living in a mountain cabin. "Can I help you?" she asked in a tone that suggested she absolutely did not want to help me with anything. "You can help me by explaining why you're in my house," I said, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. Her eyes narrowed. "Your house? I don't know who you think you are, but this property has been claimed under adverse possession laws. It was abandoned for 3 months during peak winter season, which constitutes negligence and abandonment." I stared at her, genuinely speechless for a moment. Adverse possession? "Lady, I've been deployed. This is my cabin. I own it, and you need to get out, now." She pulled herself up to her full height, which was maybe 5'4". "I'm Brenda Whitmore, president of the Mountain Ridge Homeowners Association. This property falls under our jurisdiction, and we have strict rules about abandoned properties, especially during winter months. The accumulation of snow on your driveway and walkways presented a hazard to the community. Since you failed to maintain the property or respond to our notices, the HOA took possession." "What HOA?" I asked, my confusion deepening. "There was no HOA when I bought this place. I specifically bought out here to avoid that nonsense." Brenda's smile was the kind that never reached her eyes. "The Mountain Ridge HOA was established 4 months ago by a majority vote of property owners in this area. We sent notices to all residents. Your failure to respond or pay the mandatory dues gave us legal right to take action." "I was deployed," I repeated slowly, like I was talking to a child. "I was serving my country. I didn't get any notices because I was in a combat zone. And even if there was an HOA, which I never agreed to join, that doesn't give you the right to break into my house and change my locks." "The property was secured, not broken into," she corrected me with that infuriating smugness. "We followed all proper procedures. If you have a complaint, you can file it with the HOA board. Meetings are every 3rd Tuesday at the community center." I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my head like my therapist had taught me for managing combat-related stress. "Let me be very clear, Brenda. I am giving you exactly 5 minutes to gather whatever belongings you brought here and get out of my house. If you're not out in 5 minutes, I'm calling the sheriff." "The sheriff is very familiar with our HOA," she said confidently. "In fact, Deputy Anderson is on our board. If you call them, they'll just explain the same thing I'm telling you. This property is currently under HOA management until all outstanding fees and violations are resolved. You owe approximately $6,000 in back dues, emergency maintenance fees, and violation penalties." My jaw actually dropped. $6,000? For 3 months? "Late fees compound daily," she said with a shrug. "Plus, there were multiple violations. Unmowed lawn before the snow, exterior paint not in compliance with community standards, and that unauthorized outbuilding. She pointed at my tool shed. That required HOA architectural approval, which you never obtained. The shed was here when I bought the property 5 years ago. There was no HOA. Existing structures must be registered and approved retroactively, Brenda explained, as if this was the most reasonable thing in the world. It's all in the bylaws. I pulled out my phone. I'm calling the sheriff right now. Go ahead, she said, and actually retreated back inside my house and closed the door in my face. I stood there on my own porch, locked out of my own cabin, and dialed 911. The dispatcher who answered sounded bored as I explained the situation. So someone's in your house? She asked. Yes, a woman named Brenda Whitmore. She claims some HOA gave her the right to take over my property while I was deployed. There was a pause. Sir, if this is a civil dispute over HOA matters, that's not really an emergency situation. You might need to contact a lawyer. It's not a civil dispute, it's breaking and entering. She changed my locks. She's living in my house without my permission. Another pause. I'll send a deputy out. It might be a while, though. We've got a lot of accidents from the snow today. I hung up and walked around my cabin, checking every window and door, all locked, all secure. Brenda had literally fortified my own house against me. Through the windows, I could see my furniture, my belongings, everything exactly where I'd left it, but now with Brenda's additions scattered around, women's magazines on my coffee table, a ridiculous collection of scented candles, a yoga mat rolled up in the corner of my living room. The audacity was almost impressive. I went back to my truck and waited, the heater running, my mind racing through every possible legal angle. I'd been in combat situations that were less surreal than this. At least in combat, the rules were clear. This was some bureaucratic nightmare I wasn't equipped for. 45 minutes later, headlights appeared down the road. A Summit County Sheriff's cruiser pulled up behind my truck. A deputy in his 30s stepped out, and I met him halfway. Deputy Anderson? I asked. That's right. You're the homeowner? Henry Kolson. And yes, I own this cabin. I pulled out my wallet and showed him my ID, my military ID, and my concealed carry permit. I've been deployed for the last 3 months. I came home to find someone living in my house. Anderson looked uncomfortable. Mr. Kolson, I'm aware of the situation. Mrs. Whitmore called me when you showed up. She said you were being aggressive. Aggressive? I knocked on my own door and asked her to leave my property. Look, Anderson said, running a hand through his hair, I'm not saying I agree with how this went down, but technically, the HOA did follow procedure. They posted notice on your door, sent certified letters, and after 30 days with no response, they took action under emergency maintenance provisions. I was in Afghanistan, I said, enunciating each word. How was I supposed to respond to letters? Do you have someone who handles your affairs while you're deployed? A property manager? Family member? I did, actually. My sister was supposed to check on the place, but she lived in Denver and had her own life. I couldn't expect her to drive up here every week during a rough winter. That's irrelevant. The HOA has no authority here. I never joined any HOA. I never agreed to any bylaws. Anderson shifted his weight. According to Colorado law, if a majority of property owners in a defined area vote to establish an HOA, it can become mandatory for all properties within those boundaries. It's complicated, but it's legal. So someone can just vote to take control of my property without my consent? Not exactly, but they can impose dues and regulations. Look, this is really a civil matter. You're going to need to either pay the outstanding fees or challenge the HOA's authority in court. But I can't just remove Mrs. Whitmore tonight. Legally, she's been residing there for 3 months. That establishes certain rights. I felt like I was losing my mind. She broke into my house. She says the HOA had a locksmith open the door legally under emergency maintenance provisions. The property was unattended during severe weather, which presented risks. What risks? It's a cabin. It's meant to survive winter. Anderson looked at me sympathetically. Mr. Kolson, I understand your frustration. I really do. Thank you for your service, but my hands are tied here. This is a civil dispute. You need to get a lawyer and take it to court. In the meantime, I'd suggest finding somewhere else to stay. Where? I demanded. This is my home. I spent 3 months in a combat zone thinking about coming back here, and now you're telling me I have to sleep in a hotel because some HOA Karren decided to play house? I'm sorry, Anderson said, and he actually did sound sorry. But if you try to force entry, she can press charges for breaking and entering. I know that sounds insane, but that's the legal reality right now. I wanted to argue more, but I could tell it was pointless. Anderson was uncomfortable but clearly not willing to go against Brenda. The HOA connection he had probably made this even more complicated. After Anderson left, I sat in my truck and made calls. First to my sister Emily, who was horrified and guilty when I explained what happened. She swore she'd driven up once, but the snow was so bad she'd only checked from the road and everything looked fine. Then I called my old college roommate Marcus, who was now a lawyer in Colorado Springs. "Henry," Marcus answered cheerfully, "you're back. How was the deployment?" "Terrible question right now. I need legal help." I explained the entire situation, my voice getting tighter with each detail. Marcus was silent for a moment after I finished. "Okay, that's absolutely insane. But unfortunately, it's not impossible under Colorado law. HOAs have been given increasing powers over the last decade. However, there are some serious problems with what they did. First, if you were deployed, there are federal protections under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. They can't just take action against your property without accommodating your military service. Second, adverse possession requires way more than 3 months. That's laughable. And third, breaking in and changing locks is still criminal, no matter what they call it. So what do I do? Right now, document everything. Take photos, get copies of whatever notices they claim to have sent. Don't engage with this Brenda person beyond what's necessary. I'll file an emergency motion first thing tomorrow morning to have her removed from the property. We should be able to get an expedited hearing given your military service. In the meantime, do you have somewhere to stay? I'll get a hotel in Breckenridge. Do that. And Henry, don't do anything stupid. I know your training makes you want to handle this directly, but let the courts work. I promised I'd behave, though every fiber of my being wanted to kick down my own door and throw Brenda out into the snow. Instead, I took photos of everything: the changed locks, the smoke from my chimney, the tire tracks. I even knocked on the door again and asked Brenda to provide me with copies of the notices she claimed to have sent. She cracked the door just wide enough to pass out a folder. "Everything's documented here. You'll also find the bylaws and fee schedule. As I said, once you pay the outstanding balance and agree to comply with community standards, we can discuss a transition plan." A transition plan for my own house? The HOA will need to inspect the property to ensure no damage occurred during your occupancy. There's a $50 inspection fee. I took the folder before I said something I'd regret. "You're going to regret this, Brenda." "Is that a threat?" she asked sharply, because threatening an HOA board member is grounds for additional penalties. I walked away before my self-control snapped. The hotel in Breckenridge cost $180 for the night, which felt like adding insult to injury since I owned a perfectly good house 15 minutes away. I spread the contents of Brenda's folder across the hotel bed and read through everything with mounting disbelief. The notices were printed on official-looking letterhead for the Mountain Ridge Homeowners Association. 3 letters supposedly sent to my address in November, December, and January, each one escalating in tone from "Welcome to the HOA" to "Final notice of violation" to "Emergency action required." The bylaws were 47 pages of dense legalese outlining every conceivable restriction on property use: grass height limits, approved paint colors, restrictions on outdoor decorations, vehicle parking, noise levels, pet ownership, and on and on. The fee schedule showed a monthly due of $85 plus a $500 initiation fee plus individual charges for various services the HOA provided. I couldn't find any legitimate documentation showing how the HOA was formed or what properties it actually covered. The board consisted of 5 people: Brenda Whitmore as president, Deputy Anderson as treasurer, and 3 other names I didn't recognize. My phone rang. It was my neighbor, old Tom Chen, who lived about a quarter-mile down the mountain road. "Henry, I heard you were back. Someone told me they saw your truck." "Tom, what the hell is going on with this HOA?" Tom sighed heavily. "It's been a nightmare, son. Brenda moved into that new development about 6 months ago, those townhouses they built off Highway 9. She decided our whole area needed an HOA and started pushing for it. Got a bunch of the new residents to vote for it. Those of us who've been here for years, we didn't want any part of it, but somehow she got it approved through the county. How can they force existing properties to join? Some loophole in Colorado law. If enough properties in a geographic area vote to form an HOA, it becomes mandatory for everyone in that area. It's supposed to be for situations where common resources need management, like shared roads or water systems, but Brenda's using it as her personal fiefdom. She's been fining people left and right. Old Mrs. Patterson down the way got hit with $800 in violations because her mailbox wasn't the right shade of brown. And nobody's fought back? Most folks can't afford lawyers, and Brenda's married to some hotshot attorney in Denver, so she knows how to work the system. A couple people tried to challenge it but got buried in paperwork and legal fees. I've been keeping my head down and paying the minimum to avoid trouble. She's living in my house, Tom. I know, I saw her moving in back in November. I thought maybe you'd rented it out or something. I tried calling you but couldn't get through. I was deployed, no regular phone access. That woman's got some nerve, but I'm not surprised. She's been on a power trip since day one. You should hear her at the HOA meetings. She talks about maintaining community standards and protecting property values like she's running a dictatorship. We talked for another 20 minutes. Tom filled me in on all the other absurd things Brenda had done. She'd tried to ban pickup trucks from being parked in driveways because they weren't aesthetically pleasing. She'd attempted to force everyone to use the same landscaping company, which turned out to be owned by her cousin. She'd even tried to institute quiet hours that would have prohibited most normal activities after 8 p.m. By the time I hung up, I had a much clearer picture of who I was dealing with. Brenda wasn't just some random squatter. She was a control freak who'd found a legal framework to impose her will on everyone around her. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Brenda sitting in my favorite chair, using my fireplace, eating food from my kitchen. The violation of it ate at me worse than any enemy fire I'd faced overseas. Marcus called me at 7 in the morning. Good news. I've got us a hearing this afternoon. Judge Peterson is ex-military himself, and when I explained the situation, he agreed to expedite it. Be at the Summit County Courthouse in Breckenridge at 2 p.m. Dress nice, bring all your documentation, and be prepared to testify. I spent the morning gathering every piece of evidence I could. Property deed, mortgage statements, military deployment orders, photos from yesterday. I even drove back to my cabin and took more pictures in daylight. Brenda's car was still in my garage. I could see her moving around inside through the windows. The courthouse was a modern building with mountain views. Marcus met me outside, looking sharp in a suit. We went over the strategy. He'd argued that the HOA's actions violated federal protections for deployed service members, that their seizure of the property was illegal, regardless of any claimed HOA authority, and that I was entitled to immediate possession of my home. Judge Peterson was a stern man in his 60s with a military bearing that never quite goes away. The hearing was in his chambers rather than a full courtroom. Brenda showed up with her husband, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Richard Whitmore, attorney at law. Richard immediately launched into a long explanation of HOA law, citing case after case of HO as exercising emergency maintenance authority. He argued that his wife had acted entirely within her rights as HOA president, that the property had been abandoned during dangerous winter conditions, and that the HOA had followed all proper procedures. Marcus countered with the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Your Honor, Mr. Kolson was deployed on active duty. Federal law specifically prohibits taking adverse action against service members' property during deployment without a court order. The HOA had no right to enter his property, change his locks, or take possession regardless of any claimed violations. Judge Peterson looked at Richard. Did the HOA know Mr. Kolson was deployed? Richard hesitated for just a second. We had no way of knowing his whereabouts. The property appeared abandoned. Bull, I said before I could stop myself. Judge Peterson's eyes shifted to me. Mr. Kolson? Sorry, Your Honor, but that's not true. My military status is public record. Anyone who looked up my name would find it. And my vehicle registration shows my military status. My plates have veteran tags. They didn't bother to check because they didn't care. Brenda spoke up for the first time, her voice dripping with false concern. Your Honor, we certainly respect Mr. Kolson's service, but the safety of the community had to take priority. The snow accumulation on his property was creating dangerous conditions. Ice dams were forming. Tree branches were threatening to fall on neighboring properties. We had no choice but to take action. By moving in and living there, Judge Peterson asked dryly. Someone needed to monitor the property through the winter, Brenda said. I volunteered to ensure it was properly maintained. I've been shoveling the walkways, running the heat to prevent pipe freezing, and conducting regular safety inspections. How generous of you, Marcus said. And I'm sure it had nothing to do with having a free luxury mountain cabin to use all winter. Richard glared at Marcus. That's an unfair characterization. My wife has been providing a service to the community. Judge Peterson held up a hand. I've heard enough. Here's my ruling. First, the HOA's seizure of Mr. Kolson's property was improper under federal law. The Service Members Civil Relief Act requires specific procedures before taking action against deployed service members, none of which were followed here. Second, even if the HOA had legitimate authority, changing the locks and taking exclusive possession goes beyond emergency maintenance. That's conversion at minimum, possibly criminal trespass. Third, I'm ordering Mrs. Whitmore to vacate the property immediately and restore possession to Mr. Kolson. Brenda's face went bright red. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The HOA has legitimate authority. The HOA's general authority isn't what's at issue here, Mrs. Whitmore. Your specific actions violated federal law. You will vacate the property by 6 p.m. today. Mr. Kolson will be present to ensure nothing is removed except your personal belongings. If you have concerns about HOA fees or violations, those can be addressed through proper channels, not by squatting in someone's home. Richard tried to argue, but Judge Peterson shut him down. My ruling stands. If you want to appeal, that's your right. But the immediate order is for your wife to vacate today. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt like a weight had been lifted. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder. That went as well as we could have hoped. Peterson was not impressed with their arguments. Can she actually appeal? She can try, but she won't win. The Service Members Civil Relief Act is pretty clear, and honestly, I think even her husband knows they crossed a line. He looked uncomfortable in there. At 6 p.m., I pulled up to my cabin with Marcus following in his car. Brenda's car was still in the garage, but she was outside loading suitcases into it. She didn't look at me as I approached. I need you to return the keys, I said. She slammed a suitcase into her trunk. They're on the kitchen counter. I'm going to do a walkthrough to make sure everything's as I left it. Fine, she bit the word out. Marcus and I entered my cabin. It looked mostly the same, but there were little changes that made my skin crawl. Different soap in the bathroom, her food in my refrigerator, her clothes in my guest room, a stack of HOA paperwork on my dining table. The keys were on the counter as promised, but they were only the new keys she'd had made. Where are my original keys? I called out. Brenda came to the doorway. I don't know. The locksmith disposed of the old locks. Of course he did. I checked the rest of the house. Nothing appeared to be stolen or damaged, at least not obviously. But the violation of someone living in my space, using my things, was hard to shake. Brenda finished loading her car. Before she left, she turned to me with a look of pure venom. This isn't over. You still owe the HOA fees, and you still have multiple violations that need to be addressed. The board will be meeting next week to discuss further action. The board can discuss whatever they want, I said. I'm not paying any fees, and I'm certainly not following any bylaws I never agreed to. Colorado law says otherwise. Then I guess I'll see you in court again. She drove off, her tires spinning in the snow. Marcus watched her go and shook his head. That woman's going to be a problem. Let her try. She just lost the first battle. After Marcus left, I spent the evening reclaiming my space. I changed the sheets Brenda had slept in. I threw out her food. I scrubbed the bathroom. I built a fire in my fireplace and tried to relax, but the anger was still simmering. The next morning, I called the Summit County Assessor's office and started digging into the HOA's formation. The clerk I spoke with was helpful and sent me digital copies of the paperwork. Reading through it, I found some interesting discrepancies. The petition to form the HOA listed 23 properties within the defined boundaries. 18 property owners had supposedly voted in favor. But looking at the signatures, I recognized several as being from the new townhouse development where Brenda lived. Those were technically in a different subdivision with different access roads. I called Tom Chen. "Tom, do you remember voting on forming the HOA?" "Hell no. First I heard about it was when Brenda showed up demanding dues." I called several other longtime property owners in the area. None of them remembered voting. None of them had attended any formation meeting. It was starting to look like Brenda had pulled a fast one, possibly forging signatures or manipulating the vote somehow. I compiled all my findings and sent them to Marcus. He called me back within an hour. "Henry, this is good stuff. If the HOA formation was fraudulent, the entire thing could be invalid. That would wipe out all their claimed authority. I'm going to dig deeper into this. In the meantime, has Brenda contacted you again?" "No, but I'm expecting it." I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived. It was from the Mountain Ridge HOA board, signed by Brenda and the other board members. The letter informed me that my property had been inspected, without my permission or presence, and found to have multiple violations. The list was absurd. Exterior paint fading, gutters needing cleaning, unapproved window coverings, landscaping not meeting standards, impossible to judge under 4 feet of snow, and on and on. The total fines came to $4,200. The letter demanded payment within 30 days, or the HOA would place a lien on my property. I called Marcus and read him the letter. "They're insane," he said. "But unfortunately, if the HOA is legitimate, they can impose fines and eventually place liens. However, based on what you found about the formation, I think we can challenge the entire HOA's existence. I'm going to file a lawsuit on your behalf, questioning the validity of the HOA formation. That should freeze any collection actions." "How long will that take?" "Months, probably. HOA litigation is slow, but in the meantime, they can't actually enforce anything while it's being challenged." Over the next few weeks, the situation escalated. Brenda started showing up at my property unannounced, claiming she needed to conduct follow-up inspections. I refused her entry every time, which led to more violation notices for obstruction of HOA duties. The other property owners in the area started reaching out to me. It turned out I wasn't the only one Brenda was harassing. She'd fined Tom Chen for having the wrong color trash cans. She'd cited Margaret Patterson for having a bird feeder that attracted wildlife. She'd even tried to fine young couple for having a baby stroller visible from the street. At Marcus's suggestion, I organized a meeting of all the affected property owners at Tom's house. 15 people showed up, all with stories of Brenda's overreach. "She fined me $300 because my dog barked during the day," said Jeff Morrison, a guy about my age who worked from home. "During the day, it's a dog. Dogs bark." "She tried to make me cut down a tree on my property," added Sarah Kim, "a 100-year-old pine tree because it didn't fit the aesthetic vision for the community." Everyone had similar stories. Brenda was using the HOA as her personal weapon to control everyone around her. "Here's what Marcus found," I said, spreading out the documents. "The HOA formation looks fraudulent. Half the signatures on the petition don't match the supposed signers. Several people claim they never signed anything, and the meeting where it was supposedly voted on, several people who supposedly attended have no memory of it." Tom leaned forward, studying the papers. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying the HOA might not be legal at all. And if it's not legal, none of these fines or rules are enforceable." "Can we prove it?" Sarah asked. "We're working on it, but I need your help. If any of you supposedly signed this petition or attended the formation meeting but didn't actually do so, I need you to provide affidavits to my lawyer. We're building a case to dissolve the entire HOA." By the end of the meeting, I had 12 people willing to provide statements that the HOA formation had been fraudulent. Several people had supposedly signed the petition but swore they'd never seen it. 3 people were listed as attending the formation meeting when they had actually been out of town. Marcus was thrilled when I sent him everything. "This is gold, Henry. With this many witness statements, we can definitely prove fraud. I'm going to file an amended complaint adding charges of fraud and requesting immediate dissolution of the HOA." But Brenda wasn't backing down. She escalated by filing a complaint with the county claiming my property was a public nuisance. She alleged that I was running some kind of illegal boarding house because Tom and other neighbors occasionally visited. She claimed I was violating noise ordinances. She even suggested I was dealing drugs, which was so absurd it would have been funny if it wasn't potentially dangerous to my reputation. The county sent an inspector out, who found absolutely nothing wrong. But it was another hassle, another violation, another way Brenda was making my life difficult. Then things took a darker turn. One night in late February, I woke to the sound of breaking glass. I grabbed my handgun from the bedside safe and moved through the house carefully, using all my military training. Someone had thrown a rock through my living room window. Attached to the rock was a note, "Pay your dues or face consequences." I called 911. This time, a different deputy responded, not Anderson. Deputy Linda Torres was professional and thorough. She documented everything, took the rock and note as evidence, and promised to investigate. "Do you know who might have done this?" she asked. "I have suspicions," I said, and explained the HOA situation. Torres frowned. "I've heard about this HOA. There have been other complaints. This is criminal mischief at minimum, possibly intimidation. If you can prove who did it, we can press charges." The next morning, I checked my security cameras. I'd installed them after getting back, paranoid about Brenda trying something. The footage clearly showed a figure approaching my house around 2 a.m. They were wearing dark clothes and a ski mask, so I couldn't identify them, but their build and gait looked female, about Brenda's size. I sent the footage to Deputy Torres and Marcus. Torres said she'd investigate, but without a clear identification, it was hard to charge anyone. Marcus suggested I get a restraining order against Brenda. Based on her pattern of harassment, the fraudulent HOA, and now this vandalism, I think we can make a case that she's a threat, Marcus said. We filed for a restraining order. The hearing was set for the following week. In the meantime, I upgraded my security system and started documenting every interaction with Brenda or anyone from the HOA. The restraining order hearing was contentious. Brenda showed up with Richard again. She denied everything, claimed she was the victim of my harassment, and even cried on the stand about how she was just trying to serve her community and I was targeting her because I didn't like authority. It was a good performance, but Marcus systematically destroyed her credibility. He presented the evidence of her squatting in my house, the harassment through fake violations, the threatening letter, the security footage of someone matching her description vandalizing my property. The judge granted a temporary restraining order requiring Brenda to stay at least 500 feet away from me and my property. She was also prohibited from contacting me directly and from conducting any HOA business involving my property. Brenda's face was purple with rage as we left the courthouse. Richard grabbed her arm and pulled her away before she could say anything that would make things worse. "That went well," Marcus said. "Now, about the main lawsuit challenging the HOA. We have a hearing scheduled for next month. I'm confident we can get the HOA dissolved entirely based on the fraud evidence." But before that hearing could happen, things exploded in a way I never expected. Deputy Torres called me one evening in early March. "Mr. Kolson, I need you to come down to the sheriff's office. We've made some discoveries about your HOA situation that you need to know about." I drove down immediately, my mind racing through possibilities. At the sheriff's office, Torres led me to a conference room where several other people were waiting, including a detective I didn't recognize. "Mr. Kolson, this is Detective Frank Ramirez from our Financial Crimes Unit," Torres said. Ramirez shook my hand. "Thanks for coming in. We've been investigating the Mountain Ridge HOA based on your complaints and others. What we found is bigger than we expected." He opened a file folder and spread out documents. Brenda Whitmore has been running a fraud scheme. The HOA itself is legitimate, technically. It was properly formed through the county, but Mrs. Whitmore has been embezzling the funds collected. Of the approximately $70,000 in dues and fees collected over the past few months, only about $12,000 has gone to legitimate HOA expenses. The rest went into personal accounts controlled by her. I stared at the documents. $70,000? She's been aggressive in collecting fees from a wide area. Some properties probably don't even realize they're supposedly in the HOA boundaries, and the fees she's been charging are outrageous. It's basically a scam. What about her husband? Richard's a lawyer. He must know what she's doing. We're investigating his involvement. At minimum, he's been providing legal cover for her operation, but we think he might be more actively involved. Torres jumped in. There's more. We recovered video footage from a neighbor's security camera. It clearly shows Brenda Whitmore throwing the rock through your window. She was trying to intimidate you into paying. Can you arrest her? We already did, Ramirez said with satisfaction. About 2 hours ago, she's being charged with embezzlement, fraud, criminal mischief, and intimidation. Her husband is being questioned. Depending on what we find, he might face charges too. I sat back processing this. What happens to the HOA? That's a civil matter for the courts to decide. But given that the president was running a criminal enterprise, I imagine it'll be dissolved. Any money we can recover will be returned to the property owners who paid in. Over the next few weeks, the case became local news. HOA, president arrested for fraud, ran in the Summit Daily News. The story detailed Brenda's scheme, her harassment of property owners, and even mentioned my situation with her squatting in my cabin. Other victims came forward. It turned out Brenda had been running similar scams in 2 other counties before starting the Mountain Ridge HOA. She had a pattern of moving to new areas, establishing HOAs, collecting aggressive fees, and then disappearing with the money before anyone caught on. She'd just gotten greedier and sloppier with Mountain Ridge. Richard tried to distance himself from Brenda, claiming he had no knowledge of her criminal activities. But prosecutors found emails between them discussing how to maximize fee collection and minimize transparency. He ended up facing charges for conspiracy and money laundering. The HOA lawsuit became moot when the county officially dissolved the Mountain Ridge HOA following Brenda's arrest. All outstanding fees and fines were voided. The few legitimate expenses the HOA had incurred were paid from the recovered embezzled funds, and the rest was distributed back to property owners who'd paid in. I got a check for $900, representing the minimal dues I'd officially owed before everything went sideways. Tom Chen got back almost $3,000. Some of the townhouse owners who'd been paying since the beginning got even more. In April, Brenda's trial began. I was called as a witness to describe her squatting in my property and the subsequent harassment. Sitting in that witness box describing how I'd come home from deployment to find someone living in my house, I saw several jury members shaking their heads in disgust. The prosecutor did an excellent job laying out the full scope of Brenda's fraud, the fake violations, the excessive fees, the embezzlement, the intimidation tactics. By the time they rested their case, Brenda looked like exactly what she was, a con artist who'd weaponized bureaucracy. Richard took a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Brenda in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony was damning. He admitted they'd planned the whole scheme together, targeting areas with wealthy property owners and minimal existing organization. Brenda would establish the HOA and collect fees while Richard provided legal cover and threatened anyone who resisted. They'd done it successfully in 3 other locations before Mountain Ridge. They'd stolen over $200,000 combined across all their schemes. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge was harsh. Mrs. Whitmore, you exploited people's trust and used the legal framework of homeowner associations as a weapon. You targeted vulnerable property owners, including a deployed service member, for your personal gain. You showed no remorse and continued your harassment even after being caught. I'm sentencing you to 6 years in state prison and ordering full restitution to all victims. Richard got 3 years, plus disbarment proceedings were initiated against him. Walking out of the courthouse after sentencing, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Marcus walked with me, looking satisfied. Justice served, he said. Took long enough. These things always do. But hey, you got your house back, the HOA is gone, and the bad guys are going to prison. That's a win in my book. He was right. But the experience had changed something in me. I'd survived combat deployments, dangerous missions, situations where my life was on the line. But somehow, a middle-aged woman with a fake HOA had caused me more stress than any enemy combatant. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset over the Rockies. The snow was finally melting, revealing the brown grass underneath. Spring was coming to the mountains. My cabin was mine again, truly and completely. Tom Chen walked up the driveway carrying a six-pack of beer. Figured you might want to celebrate. Good timing, I said, accepting a bottle. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking beer and watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. You know what the funny thing is? Tom said eventually. We probably could have used a real HOA around here. Something to maintain the shared road, coordinate snow plowing, maybe organize community events. But Brenda poisoned that well completely. Nobody's going to want to hear the words homeowner association for years. Maybe that's for the best, I said. I moved up here to get away from that kind of organized community nonsense. Fair enough. Tom raised his beer. To independence and keeping crazy people out of our houses. I clinked my bottle against his. I'll drink to that. The next few months were peaceful in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I settled back into civilian life, started taking classes at the community college using my GI Bill, and began the slow process of decompressing from years of military service. The cabin that had been violated by Brenda's presence slowly started feeling like home again. I replaced the locks again, even though I had the keys now. Something about knowing Brenda had touched them made me want fresh ones. I tore out and replaced the guest room bed where she'd slept. I even had the whole house professionally cleaned, which was probably overkill but made me feel better. The story of HOA Karren became something of a local legend. I'd go into town and people would recognize me from the news coverage. Some wanted to shake my hand and thank me for exposing Brenda. Others just wanted to hear the story firsthand. Is it true she was living in your house when you got back from Afghanistan? The barista at my favorite coffee shop asked one morning. Iraq, actually. But yes, that's true. That's crazy. What did you do? Got a lawyer and let the system work. It was a boring answer, but it was the truth. Much as my training might have prepared me to handle things more directly, living in a society of laws meant using those laws, even when they moved frustratingly slowly. Deputy Torres stopped by one afternoon in May. She was off duty, just checking in. How are you doing, Mr. Kolson? Call me Henry, and I'm doing fine. Better now that it's all over. I wanted to apologize for how Deputy Anderson handled things initially. He's been reassigned after the investigation found he'd been taking money from Brenda to look the other way. I figured something like that was going on. We take corruption seriously. He'll be facing charges too, though probably lesser ones. But I wanted you to know that most of us are trying to do the job right. I never doubted that. You certainly did, she smiled. Well, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call. And thank you for your service, my brother's army too. After she left, I thought about how many people had helped me through this mess. Marcus with his legal expertise, Tom with his local knowledge and support, Torres with her professional investigation, the other property owners who came forward with evidence, even Judge Peterson with his understanding of military service. Yeah, Brenda had caused massive problems, but the response from the community had been overwhelmingly positive. That meant something. In June, I got a letter from the Colorado Restitution Office. Brenda's assets had been seized and liquidated. I was being sent an additional $3,000 to compensate for the hassle, stress, and violation of my property. It wouldn't ever really make up for coming home to find someone living in my house, but it was something. I used part of the money to install a top-of-the-line security system, complete with cameras covering every angle of my property. If anyone ever tried something like this again, I'd have irrefutable evidence immediately. The rest I donated to a veterans legal aid organization that Marcus recommended. They helped deployed service members with legal issues, exactly the kind of thing I could have used when this whole mess started. You don't have to do that, Marcus said when I told him. I know, but I was lucky I had you. A lot of vets don't have someone they can call. If this money helps one person avoid what I went through, it's worth it. Summer in the Rockies is spectacular, and I spent as much time as possible outside. Hiking, fishing, just sitting on my porch reading. I was healing, both from the deployment and from the Brenda situation. PTSD is a strange thing. The combat didn't give me nightmares, but coming home to find someone in my house did for a while. A therapist at the VA explained it. Your home is supposed to be your safe space. Having that violated triggers something primal. It's actually not unusual for service members to struggle more with civilian violations of trust than with combat trauma. The nightmares faded eventually. The cabin started feeling safe again. I could walk in my door without wondering if someone would be inside. Small victories. In August, I ran into someone I hadn't expected to see. Richard Whitmore was at a gas station in Breckenridge, pumping gas into a beat-up sedan. He looked haggard, like he'd aged 10 years and 6 months. He saw me and froze. For a moment, I thought he might try to run or say something hostile. Instead, he just looked defeated. "Henry," he said quietly. "Richard, I'm sorry. For all of it. I know that doesn't mean much, but I am genuinely sorry." I studied him, trying to gauge if he meant it. He looked sincere in his misery. "Why'd you do it?" I asked. "You're a lawyer. You had a legitimate career. Why throw it away for this?" He laughed bitterly. "Greed, mostly. And Brenda had a way of making things seem reasonable. She'd say we were just enforcing standards, protecting property values. By the time I realized how far it had gone, I was in too deep. You could have stopped. I know, I should have, especially when she started targeting you. A deployed service member, for God's sake. I knew that was wrong, but I was weak." We stood there awkwardly for a moment. "Are you going to be okay?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. "Prison was hard. Lost my law license, my house, my marriage. Brenda blames me for everything now. But I'm out, and I'm trying to rebuild. Got a job doing paralegal work. It's humbling. Good luck with it." "Thank you, and again, I'm sorry. What we did to you was inexcusable." He finished pumping gas and drove away. I stood there thinking about second chances and consequences. Richard was paying for his crimes, but he seemed to have learned something. Brenda, from what I'd heard, was still denying any wrongdoing and planning appeals. Some people learn, some don't. By September, a full year after I'd left for deployment, life had found a new rhythm. I was taking classes in forestry management, thinking about a second career working for the National Forest Service. My time in the mountains had given me an appreciation for wilderness that I wanted to channel into something productive. The property owners in my area, the ones who'd been victimized by Brenda's fake HOA, occasionally got together for barbecues or just to hang out. We'd bonded through the shared trauma in a weird way. Tom joked that we were our own support group. "Survivors of HOA abuse," he'd say with a laugh, but there was truth in it. We'd all been targeted by someone who'd weaponized bureaucracy. We'd all felt helpless against a system that seemed designed to empower petty tyrants. And we'd all come through it together. One evening in late September, exactly a year after I'd left for deployment, I sat on my porch with a glass of whiskey and thought about everything that had happened. The deployment, coming home to find Brenda in my house, the legal battles, the investigation, the trial, the resolution. It had been one of the strangest, most frustrating years of my life. But I'd survived. More than survived, really. I'd fought back against something insidious and won, not through force or violence, but through persistence and the legal system. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Saw Brenda lost her appeal. 6 years is final." I smiled and texted back. "Good." The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A cool breeze drifted down from the peaks, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of autumn. My cabin stood solid around me, mine again in every meaningful way. Somewhere in a Colorado state prison, Brenda Whitmore was spending another night in a cell, paying for her crimes. Her husband was working a humble job, rebuilding a shattered life. The mountain ridge. HOA was a memory, a cautionary tale people told about power run amok. And I was home, finally and completely, with nothing but mountains and peace ahead of me. The nightmare was over. The Karren had been vanquished. And life, as it always does, went on. I raised my glass to the mountains, to justice, to home. Then I went inside, locked my door with keys only I had ever touched, and settled in for a quiet evening in the cabin I'd built with my own hands. The cabin that was mine. The cabin that would always be mine. No HOA, no Brenda, no violations or fees or threats, just peace, hard-won and well-deserved. And that, finally, was enough.